Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bain.
And I'm Robbie Herlocker. Today we are discussing Act 2 of the musical 1776, America's award-winning musical.
Last time on Hamilton the Podcast, we took you through the first act of 1776, and we discussed how they got the idea for writing the Declaration of Independence and how they proceeded from there to write the Declaration of Independence.
That's right. Act 1 covers the summer of 1776, leading up to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. So we got to see people like Richard Henry Lee come forward and propose independence, saying, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be totally dissolved. And so that was known as the Lee Resolution, put in front of the Continental Congress in June of 1776. And for the next month, congressmen were gathering opinions from their constituents, trying to see who supports independence, who doesn't. And there were lots of things happening in the colonies. Some towns decided to draft their own little independent versions of declarations of independence, and they wrote their own House of Burgesses and their own state houses to say, hey, get behind this, or hey, don't you dare get behind this. And so there were interesting things happening during that month of opinions flying over whether we should declare independency or not. And now here we are. During the act break, Thomas Jefferson finally sat down and put a pen to his paper and has drafted the Declaration of Independence. And here we are, the beginning of July, 1776, and this act opens with the Congress reading the Declaration.
And if I do say so myself, the first act summed it up spectacularly. Fantastically.
Wonderful Lee.
Wonderful Lee. Here's a Lee, there's a Lee, everywhere a Lee, a Lee.
I do think it summarizes the events leading up to this very, very well. It's definitely not entirely historical. Obviously, Benjamin Franklin didn't get up from his gouty leg and then start dancing a can-can on a stairway.
You don't know that.
You know what? I'm not there. That's in my headcanon now. I believe that that's history.
This is history. There was a moment in Act 1 that we went over without me pointing out, but I really enjoyed this moment, so I wanted to bring it up now. It's when Adams is talking about the way we're going to view history, that idea from Hamilton the musical, that we don't control who tells our story and the way that history views us. He says in the musical, the way that history will remember the revolution is that, quote, Franklin smote the ground and out sprang Washington, fully grown and on his horse. Franklin then electrified them with his miraculous lightning rod, and the three of them, Franklin, Washington, and the horse, conducted the entire revolution all by themselves.
I love that summary, and it's actually something that was mostly historical. The whole comments about the horse was never said, but it's such a interesting little tidbit to remind us that the Founding Fathers were pretty fantastic and sarcastic and creative in the way they worded things.
And they were actually aware that history had its eyes on them.
Yeah, there's not a person alive who came to the Continental Congress who didn't think that they were deciding revolutionary things. And that's why you had such heightened opinions, because people saw that this is such an important moment, so we have to declare independence. Or people saw that this is such an important moment that we have to pause. And we can't make this independency decision rashly. We have to measure our actions. We have to take steps, baby steps. I think that it was Congressman Rutledge who said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, the independency idea is a great one and it's important, but not now. And in fact, we should never write a Declaration of Independence because we're about to go to war even more intently with Great Britain. And no one would be stupid enough to publish their intent and then send it to their enemy before they've actually attacked that enemy, especially when the enemy is the bigger opponent in the battle, when it is the greatest empire in the known world at the time, that they are now these Davids going up against the Goliath of Great Britain, relatives essentially saying, why would we publish our intent? And then lots of people dialogued with that concept, saying we need to publish our intent so that other nations know we're serious. Other nations know we're going to get into this, and we need to publish it so that we know what we're standing for, so we could be united. And so there are interesting ideas going back and forth, but everyone understands that this is an intensely important moment in history, and there are important decisions being made. Important decisions such as the one at the beginning of Act 2 in this musical. What should our national bird be? A turkey, an eagle, or a dove?
Just to connect it to our Hamilton musical, it sounds like Rutledge was a Burr fan. Wait for it.
Wait for it.
Talk
wait
less,
for it.
smile more. But, Robbie, you were absolutely right. Starting off with Act 2, as you mentioned before, Congress is in session reading the declaration that was written. Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams are outside waiting, and they're discussing that it feels like they're nurturing an egg that's about to hatch this new country of theirs. What kind of bird might it be in this silly song, Egg?
This is the moment from Hamilton the musical where Burr and Hamilton get together and they get to say, we're watching the afterbirth of a nation, where we understand that something is important. We're about to watch this country take its first steps. We're about to watch the egg hatch. And so Franklin's standing there and he describes them as a farmer, Jefferson, a lawyer, Adams, and a sage, the ever humble Benjamin Franklin, calling himself a sage. He says that he's a bit gouty in the leg. You know, it's quite bizarre to think that here we are playing midwives to an egg. And so that prompts the whole discussion about how America is this egg that's about to hatch. And they start discussing, I wonder what kind of a bird is going to come out of this egg. What should be the symbol of our new America? And so John Adams says that it should be the bald eagle. Jefferson says it should be the dove. And Benjamin Franklin says the turkey.
Now, this is a completely historically accurate part of our musical, 100% factual. And this is where the record scratches. And I tell you, this is not accurate whatsoever. There is a big myth about this, that these three founding fathers had this discussion and argued about which bird should be our country's bird. They did discuss an official seal, but all that came out of it was the statement, E pluribus unum, which was attributed to Jefferson. They did not decide on a bird at that time.
As you may have learned in school, E pluribus unum is the motto of the United States. It's still on our seal today. It means out of many, one. Trying to summarize the fact that we have here in the United States 13 different colonies with lots of different interests, but they're now becoming one. They're uniting behind something. And inside of each of these colonies, you have many people who are uniting behind a common dream of unity, a common dream for freedom and independence and liberty and justice for all. So that's the idea that is hatching here at the Continental Congress through the words of the Declaration of Independence. And here you see that seal they were discussing, Franklin's original draft of it was completely birdless. It didn't have a bird on it for them to discuss. But there was a moment to lend a little bit of credibility to where this myth came from that had this whole idea of Franklin saying the turkey should be the American bird. He did write to his daughter once discussing a picture that had been drawn of the bald eagle that he thought looked a lot more like a turkey. He thought it was kind of sloppy, artistic work. And he said that I'm not really upset that it was misconstrued as looking like a turkey because you know what? Thinking about it now, the turkey is a cooler bird than the eagle.
When we were researching this, I found a quote from Benjamin Franklin that had a lot of ellipses, and Robbie looked up the fuller quote. And what I found out was that the article that I was reading, which wanted us to believe that this was an actual historical fact, that Franklin wanted it to be a turkey and Adams wanted it to be the eagle, well, they misrepresented the quote quite a bit with these ellipses.
To give a small example of how this site chose to become a butcher to the Benjamin Franklin lines, just cutting out pieces that they didn't think would support their position as much as the others. One of the ellipses that came into play was cutting out the entire context of the situation. Benjamin Franklin says, I am on this account not displeased that the figure is not known as a bald eagle, but looks more like a turkey. For the truth, and then this is where the website finally picks back up again, the turkey is, in comparison, a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America. And then this line is also left out. When Benjamin Franklin acknowledges, he says, he is besides, though a little silly, a bird of courage. And I think it's funny that they left out the though a little silly part, because obviously it's Benjamin Franklin acknowledging that, yeah, it would have been a little silly to have the turkey represent us. That's just weird to do. But he's saying here that, you know, it's not that bad that people misconstrued it as a turkey because, you know what, turkeys are cool, guys.
Which is funny because when I have heard that myth from history before, the joke was that Franklin wanted us to have a turkey as a bird, as if he didn't know that was silly.
Right.
But he did. This song in particular in this musical sounds a little bit silly and unneeded when you look at the context of the story.
Right. It definitely helps to propagate that myth that we were talking about of Benjamin Franklin and the turkey, but it also could be removed entirely and you still have the conflict of the narrative. The narrative is pushing forward the passage of the Declaration of Independence, and this is literally happening outside of the room where that happens. That is not something that is necessary to the story. You could take it out and it completely keeps the entire story intact.
Which is how we feel about the majority of the songs in this musical. They don't really advance the story. If you cut them all out, the story would still exist perfectly fine.
Yeah, for the most part, that is absolutely true, that you would be missing a lot of beauty if you didn't have the songs like Egg. You'd be missing a lot of the fun if you didn't have the Lees of Virginia, but you would still have the story. It's almost like instead of using the songs to advance the plot, the writer of this musical said, okay, I'm going to tell the whole story in text and in dialogue, and then once I've agreed to have Richard Henry Lee go get the proposal from the House of Burgesses in Virginia, then I'm going to stop and sing about that for a second. Then I'm going to start the plot again, moving after the song. I'm going to have Martha Jefferson come on to the scene, and she's going to talk about her love for Jefferson and how wonderful he is, and then she's going to stop and sing a song about how he plays a violin, and then she's going to start the dialogue again after the song. You didn't need that song. It doesn't give you more details than you already knew. It's just saying something fun and beautiful and interesting for the moment. But all of the action, all of the conflict really is advanced through the dialogue, through the debates on the congressional floor. These musical numbers are kind of aside from the main conflict, which is very, very different from Hamilton, an American musical, where everything is in the text of the songs. Everything is in the dialogue of the hip-hop musical, which, to be fair, is mostly to do with the genre that we're given in Hamilton, an American musical. Hip-hop allows us to address that conflict and move forward the plot a little bit more than a musical like this, 1776, would. But still, it's interesting that mostly you have the side characters singing songs that don't advance the plot, but still indicate what is happening around them at the time.
I do believe that the musical is better for the songs. If the Lees of Old Virginia and Sit Down John were not in this musical, I would not have enjoyed it half as much.
That's actually a good segue into an email we received from one of our listeners this week. She told us about her very first interaction with 1776, the musical. And, well, Vincent, why don't you read what she wrote for us?
Right, I'll just read this email real quick. Nicole said, the first time I ever saw 1776 was when I was in college. I was taking an elective class with a very eccentric professor, not unlike Professor Trelawney from the Harry Potter novels. She had been at the college forever, only held tiny classes, I think 5 to 6 students, always in her small office, which was stuffed with furniture and prim decorations, dollies and such. There was a small TV with VCR, and we quickly learned that we would be spending every class watching videos that had absolutely nothing to do with the course topic. One of the movies we watched was 1776, but she started the film after the opening musical numbers. The students began the film with one of the early dramatic debate scenes. We had progressed through quite a bit of the film, and all of a sudden, everyone on screen just burst into song and started dancing. Truly one of the most surreal experiences of my college career. To this day, I wonder if she did it as a goof, just to see all of us react in that moment.
So big thank you to Nicole from Ohio for sharing that story with us. It made me laugh. I can't imagine just sitting in their small room with Professor Trelawney, that's who it naturally is in my mind now, watching movies day to day, and then coming across this one, and then seeing them just burst into song and dance without expecting it to be a musical at all. Definitely would have been surreal. I think that's a great story.
Right. What a great historical documentary we have here. Why are they singing now? What just happened? I love that idea.
I mean, you know me, if I was at the Continental Congress, I would totally be singing on the floor the entire time. I would make references to Hamilton, an American musical, long before the fact. I would be singing, I'd be probably dancing a little bit. They would think I was weird, but that's how I do life.
It just occurred to me that within the next generation, it may be commonplace to quote Hamilton in politics.
We've already seen that happen a number of times with Hillary Clinton at the Democratic National Convention, citing it explicitly in her acceptance speech when she accepted the Democratic Party nomination. And I know for a fact I've heard other politicians from other sides of the aisle talk about it as well. It's just such a phenomena where you have all of America discussing it. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next generation of Americans does with Hamilton.
Moving on to our next scene, we now see the Congress having accepted somewhat the Declaration of Independence, but wanting to dissect it and take certain parts out and change certain parts to their liking.
That's right. So we've now moved from the hallway back into the chamber, and you get to hear people's reactions to the text of the Declaration of Independence. And I think that in a future episode, we're going to be able to break down more of what is in the text of the Declaration. And I think that we're going to just allude to a lot of that here. But most of the Declaration was a huge indictment against King George and the way he governed the colonies.
This scene actually has a few of my favorite quotes, so I'd like to just point those out real quick. One of them being where Jefferson refuses to take out the part calling the king a tyrant. And he says, quote, "The king is a tyrant, whether we say so or not. We might as well say so."
I love that reaction because you have people in the chamber who are saying, hey, he's still your king. Do you realize how treasonous this thing is that you have written and how much we will hang for signing the document?
After he mentions that, Thompson says that he already scratched the word out, and Jefferson says, well, scratch it back in.
That's right. So they're going through the Declaration of Independence, scratching out words, scratching out paragraphs, talking about pieces they should keep in, pieces they should change, and someone takes issue with the word tyrant, and there's that whole interaction I think is just so fantastic. One of my favorite lines is when you hear people telling John Adams, this is so offensive. Why do you have to be so mean? Why do you have to have such an aggressive tone in the words you've written together as a declaration committee? Like, why do you have to be so mean? And then Adams has this great little zinger that he throws into the end there responding to them. This is a revolution, darn it. We're going to have to offend somebody.
Yeah, I love this idea that we're trying to have a revolution against this tyrant king. And yet we need to play nice here. We need to be real nice and gentlemanly. This is a revolution. We have to offend somebody to start a revolution.
Speaking about changes that different people in the Continental Congress wanted to put into the Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous and arguably most important changes that happened in the Declaration of Independence is the passage about slavery. This was something that would have changed the course of American history drastically if it was a part of our founding documents. This is something that would have probably instigated the Civil War happening decades earlier if it was a part of the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, the Declaration of Independence, as portrayed in this musical, may not have been accepted by all of the states if the passage about slavery was included. So, Vinton, what can you tell us about this passage on slavery?
So the passage in the Declaration of Independence was about abolishing slavery, bringing an end to this wicked thing. And in our musical, we have Thomas Jefferson being an avid supporter of abolishing slavery. In fact, he goes as far to say that he's already resolved to free his slaves, which, as we know from our previous discussions, was not true. It also has Franklin claiming to be the founder of the first abolitionist organization in the New World. And actually, Franklin did not become an abolitionist until after the American Revolution, when he did become president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1785. And in fact, it was Dickinson, of all of them, who freed his slaves in 1776, conditionally at first, and fully by 1787, when the Constitution was ratified. And you have Edward Rutledge leading this charge of taking this part of the Declaration of Independence out before he'll sign it, when in history, as you might expect, the majority of the Congress was for taking it out, North and South.
A lot of people thought that it would be counter to the goal of unity to attack something so integral to their economic systems. And they said, our goal now is unity. So even the abolitionists in the room decided that that was more important than, well, human lives and considering all men equal, I suppose. And they decided that they would scratch out the text on slavery.
And there's no real historical document that Edward Rutledge led anything for doing that specifically, but he does lead the song here on the subject, Molasses to Rum.
One of my favorite moments in the lead up to this song, Molasses to Rum, is when Rutledge says, speaking of slaves, they're here, yes, but they are not people. They are property. And then Thomas Jefferson, good old Tommy J, says, "No, sir, they are people who are being treated as property." So in the musical, he's talking that big game. And then Rutledge has the zinger back at him saying, "Then see to your own wounds, for you are a practitioner, are you not?" And that absolutely just puts Jefferson in his place. He sits back down, hangs his head, because, yeah, he's a slave owner. And he doesn't have the ardent abolitionist heart. He's said things about freeing slaves before. He did when he was a representative in Virginia. He did put forward something about freeing slaves and then sending them to a separate colony or something along those lines. But it never passed and it never went anywhere and nothing ever came of it. And so we have the legacy now of Tommy Jefferson and his slaves. And that's something that's well represented in Hamilton, an American musical, and kind of whitewashed a little bit in 1776.
So Edward Rutledge leads this walkout of a song, Molasses to Rum, where a bunch of the Congress gets up and leaves, the majority of them, singing about the hypocrisy of calling out slavery by the North when they also profit from it.
Can we just agree that the song Molasses to Rum is really kind of freaky and weird?
It is weird.
In the film adaptation, they really capture how creepy this song is when they're trying to change the coloration of the film on the screen or things like that, different devices to show how intense and strange this song is. But the argument that Rutledge is trying to put forward here in this song is that just because you Northerners don't have slaves of your own, that doesn't mean you don't support the slave trade, because guess who built your ships? Slaves. Guess who manned the ships to take your molasses and rum to Boston? Slaves. Guess who it was that bound up your Bibles and your rum and shipped things? Yeah, the slaves. So if you're a part of buying any goods, if you're a part of eating any farm-raised food, if you are a part of buying threads that were sewn out of the cotton fields, you are involved in the slave trade. You are guilty by association, because if you were to follow the path from slavery to yourself, the connection is very easily made from molasses to rum to slaves as a necessity for your economic habits.
Now, the actual walkout was not historical, because at this point in history, when they're deciding on the wording of the Declaration, the vote for independence was already over.
So July 2nd was the day that independence was declared, and they decided that they were going to separate from Great Britain. And it was going to be the next few days when they would eventually attach their names to the document. And it would take a while for everyone to get around to signing it and going through it. And it would be the end of the month when you'd see the final version of the calligraphied pen on parchment. But for the next few weeks and months, you'd see colonists gathering together to read the words of the Declaration of Independence to one another. You'd see people like George Washington in New York have his generals read to his soldiers the text of the Declaration over the next few days, and they would get inspired to fight. They would get inspired to the cause of 76 and to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And these words would echo throughout the chambers of American history, even till today.
But in our musical, this decision has not been made, and there is a walkout. And Franklin tries telling Adams that he should just go along with it and take the phrasing out of the Declaration, saying that the issue here is independence, and that Adams is jeopardizing their cause.
This is a bit of great characterization, where you get to see the character of Benjamin Franklin doing the compromising politician role, where he says, hey, this is the primary thing. Let's just let it go. Don't force the issue. And you see John Adams fighting with his own pride and arrogance and stubbornness, saying, I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to change it. This is so important and it's so necessary. And you see that he's not willing to compromise as easily as Franklin is. Now, it's hard for me to say that Adams is being stubborn about that, because let's just face it, slavery is evil. Slavery is awful and it is terrible. And I wish that if I were there, that I would have been fighting as ardently as John Adams was to take slavery out of the colonies and to keep this abolition of slavery in the Declaration of Independence. It's a noble cause, something that I think we can applaud our protagonist for here in the text of our musical. But all that to be said, he eventually will have to wrestle with, do we just scratch this out, allowing the evil of slavery to continue, or do we keep it in and risk losing the unity of our United States?
So Adams leaves that argument feeling shaken and hopeless. And his only encouragement comes from Abigail, who sends him another letter and a song called Compliments. It's a very short song where it can all be summarized in saying that he finally gets his delivery of kegs of saltpeter from her.
That's right. We get the saltpeter where she sees that he is absolutely down and disheartened. And as a wife who is not afraid of standing up against John Adams, like we saw in the first act, where she would stubbornly say, I'm not going to give you your saltpeter until you get pins. She is that woman who is strong, who will stand up to him, but she's also that loving woman who understands how weak he feels in this moment. And she's going to say, you know what, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure my dearest friend, John Adams, my partner in life and my partner in marriage, is going to get what he needs to warm his heart here, to get him happy. And the thing that I know he has wanted from the beginning of this musical is saltpeter. So the delivery boy comes up to John Adams as he's reading the words of Abigail as she's singing the song to him in our musical. And the delivery boy hints at the fact that he has a delivery of something. And John Adams just keeps singing to Abigail, what is this? What is this? What did you send me? And she announces at the end of her song, it's saltpeter. And it's a little bit weird to end on the word saltpeter, but we understand that that means that she is behind him 100%, supporting him in his cause and in his moments of weakness.
I also like this moment where you see Adams saying the negative things that people have said about him, saying that people say that he's obnoxious and disliked. And Abigail says, that's nonsense, John. And he says that I'm unwilling to face reality. Foolishness, John, Abigail replies. That I'm pig-headed. And here Abigail says, well, there you have me, John. I'm afraid you are pig-headed.
I like that even when she's comforting him and consoling him, she's still got that wit about her. And there's that playfulness in their relationship that they have in history and in the musical that I think is well depicted in this scene. I know I said a lot of harsh things about the depiction of Abigail in the last episode, but here it's just so sweet, and she's strong, and she is a wonderful, egalitarian, equal partner with John, and the way they handle this scene is very well done, that she is the pillar of support for him when he is weak.
So ending his letter with Abigail, you find him alone in the room, rereading a dispatch from Washington, and he's so distraught, he starts singing this song called Is Anybody There?
This is the scene where Adams is alone in the chamber, or so he thinks, and he starts singing these intimate thoughts and the dream he has for what America could be. And then he sets that dream alongside all of the confrontations that he's facing in Congress, and they want him to quit. They say, John, give up the fight. Still to England I say good night, forever good night. I have crossed the Rubicon. Let the bridge be burned behind me. Come what may, commitment. And you see that he is dedicated to the idea of independence happening. He says, all these people, all these haters gonna hate. But I am committed to the cause of independence. I'm going to make this happen. And he has this moment where he's dreaming of what it will be like when people have an America that is like the one he wants to see, a free and independent America. And he says, I see fireworks and the pageants and the pomp and parade. I hear the bells ringing out. I hear cannons roaring. I see America, all Americans, free forevermore. And then he contrasts that with how quiet it is in the chamber, how quiet and lonely it is, and how few people are speaking up for independence and for the dream that he sees. And he asks the question in closing, is there anybody there? Does anybody care? Does anybody see what I see?
And as a response, Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia comes out of the shadows and announces to Adams that he's trying to resolve his dilemma. And of course, his dilemma was that he's voting nay on independence right now, but he's conflicted. He says, I remembered something I'd once read, quote, that the representative owes the people not only his industry, but his judgment, and he betrays them if he sacrifices it to their opinion, unquote. It was written by Edmund Burke, a member of the British Parliament. Hall then walks over to the tally board, and he changes Georgia's vote from nay to yay, showing Adams that talking to yourself in an empty room can have a good purpose sometimes. Right. You never know who might overhear and be convinced by your arguments.
I think that's telling because there are times when I have doubt about what politicians say when I hear them speak publicly and I hear them say things that they would say on television, but then I'm like, yeah, but do you really believe this? But then whenever I've met some of my national representatives in local town halls, or I've gone to lunch with a couple of them myself, and I'm just talking with them, just the two of us, and I see their intimate passion and how these beliefs they hold are real and are genuine and are passionate. And it's interesting when you see that intimate connection with a person and you no longer are just demonizing them as the other side of the aisle or the enemy that you are trying to make into the other person that you never want to talk about. Those are the demons on the other shoulder to the angel on your side of the fence. That's the way we see a lot of politicians. But when you get down to the intimate moments and you see their real humanity coming through, that's what we see in this scene, where the representative of Georgia sees the representative of Massachusetts confronting his real emotions, his raw emotions, not a polished speech, just what he really wants out of this Congress. And that intimate confession of John Adams in that song is the very thing that swayed Lyman Hall's vote from nay, which is what a lot of his constituents wanted, to yay, which is what he believed was the right choice.
In our next scene, the delegates are going to return to the chamber, and Caesar Rodney, specifically of Delaware, is going to return. And he had a type of skin cancer, a face cancer, that he would cover with a green scarf. And in our musical here, he went home sick. They sent him home to die in his own bed, quote unquote. But he returns to make this vote, to voice his opinion in this Congress, which isn't completely historically accurate. He wasn't on his deathbed. He was sick. He did have the cancer, but he wasn't so far along toward his deathbed. But he did make a long, arduous journey while sick to cast this vote in history.
I appreciate the artistic license that the author takes here, though, when they sent Caesar home and then let him come back fighting for the cause of independence, fighting against his poor health to be able to be there. Because what we've seen in the drama of this musical is that we have a certain number of votes that are for independency. You have a certain number of votes that are against it. And gradually, a couple are going over to yay, a couple are going over to yes, independency, and a couple are slipping away. And Caesar was the swing vote that took Delaware into the yay column, saying, yes, we're for independency. But when he left, in the context of our musical, Delaware became a split vote, where you have one delegate supporting it, one delegate against it, so they didn't have the yes of Delaware any longer. Caesar, as a true patriot, comes off of what could have been his deathbed to stand before Congress and make sure that Delaware is in the yes column.
So the vote's going to be called, and the northern and middle colonies, save New York, who's going to abstain, quote unquote, courteously once again, as they keep doing throughout our musical, vote yay. But then the vote reaches South Carolina, and Rutledge again demands that this slavery cause be removed for him to vote yay.
I appreciate that tension that they build there with yes vote, yes vote, yes vote, and then, hey John, are you going to remove that slavery clause? And they have that little bit of back and forth. Reluctantly, they agree to take it out, and the delegate says, okay, yeah, we vote yay.
Right. And I like that moment because, again, you have Franklin trying to convince Adams, listen, first things first, we need independence. Then we can talk about slavery. If we don't secure independence, what difference will anything make? And Adams just cannot bring himself to say yes to this. So he just leaves it in Jefferson's hands. He said, Jefferson, you wrote it. You make the call. And Jefferson reluctantly walks over and scratches out the clause himself, leaving Rutledge and the Carolinas to vote yay, as does Georgia. Now, Pennsylvania's vote is the last vote needed to obtain the unanimous approval.
That's right. And if you've watched this scene, you remember that Pennsylvania was called for earlier in the list. They were going through the states saying, hey, Massachusetts, how do you vote? Hey, New York, how do you vote? Well, we abstain courteously. Hey, where do you vote? Virginia. And you go down the whole list. And Pennsylvania said, you know what, we need another minute. Pennsylvania will delay, come back to us at the end. And we know that Benjamin Franklin is in favor of independence. We know how much he's done to help get Richard Henry Lee to propose it from Virginia. We know how much he's worked with John Adams. We know that he was on the Declaration Committee with Jefferson and Adams. And yet, we don't know what the vote of his own state will be because it's another split vote.
In our musical, it comes down to Wilson, who typically sides with Dickinson over Franklin. But in this moment in our musical, he says that he doesn't want to be remembered as the person that kept independence from happening. As a matter of fact, he doesn't want to be remembered at all. He thinks the better way to not be remembered is to vote for independence and become one of the majority. Now, historically, we don't know that that's what happened. We do know that he voted yay, and that it was that vote that pushed it over, but we don't know his reasonings behind that. But I think this is a really good narrative way to tell that story.
It's also a moment where we get to see the diversity of reasons that people supported independence. Some people were like John Adams, passionately supporting it, never ever considering anything but independence. People like Jefferson were on the side of ambition and on the side of reason and natural law and supporting it for their own causes. And then you have people who are supporting independence just because their constituents said it, even though they don't like it themselves. And then you have this other person who just doesn't want to be remembered. He just wants to be in the background of history, saying, if I sign the document, then I'm just one of dozens. But if I say no, I'm going to go down in history as the one person who kept the colonies from declaring independency from Great Britain. And he didn't want that notoriety. He didn't want that. But in his hesitancy, he's reminding us that history has its eyes on you, that he has no control who's going to live and die and tell the story. But he wanted to make sure that the story that was told about him, as best as he could control it, was one where he was not the antagonist from anyone's point of view.
So Wilson does vote yay, and Dickinson is outvoted. And at this moment, John Hancock suggests that no man should be allowed to sit in Congress without signing the Declaration. But this is something that Dickinson cannot in good conscience do. And he decides he's going to leave the Congress.
The idea that everyone in the room had to sign the document was an extension of the idea that this Congress had to come to an unanimous decision agreeing that this was going to be a document that speaks for all of the colonies. This is going to be a document that represented all of them. They weren't going to come out saying, well, I didn't vote for that guy, or I didn't vote for that person. They're going to say, we are a united States of America. We are going to be independent from Great Britain, united to each other. And to use the phrase from the very end of the Declaration of Independence, they understood that they were mutually pledging to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. And so in all of this, they were agreeing that they were united to each other as brothers in this room who were going to go down together if they were going to go down at all. So that's the idea of, in our musical, needing every single person there to sign it. But as you were saying, Vinton, Dickinson found it morally objectionable to sign this document.
And in history, he knew that this would hurt his reputation. He's quoted as saying, "My conduct this day, I expect, will give the finishing blow to my once too great and, my integrity considered, now too diminished popularity." So Dickinson voluntarily left, and in our musical, he does give this nice speech about how he's willing to fight in this war for independence, to support his country in that manner, even if he's not willing to sign this document. And in history, he did leave and join the Pennsylvania militia. And later, after the war was over, he was instrumental in the Constitutional Congress as a delegate from Delaware.
That is a really stirring moment when John Dickinson, who has been this antagonistic force against John Adams this entire musical, he says that I cannot in good conscience sign this document. But he also goes on and he says, I will never stop hoping for our eventual reconciliation with England. But because in my own way, I regard America no less than does John Adams, I will join the army and fight in her defense, even though I believe that fight to be hopeless. Goodbye, gentlemen. And as John Dickinson walks out of the room, content to take up arms to defend his fellow countrymen and colonists, and John Adams, the one who has had to fight John Dickinson at every step of the musical, stands up and he says in this very silent moment as Dickinson's walking out, "Gentlemen of Congress, I say ye, John Dickinson." And he puts his arm out in acknowledgement of his former foe, and the Congress starts tapping their sticks and banging on the floor, and showing their approval. They're clapping for this guy who has shown great character in this moment. And it's interesting that you see at this moment in our musical, the resolution of it all, the protagonist and the antagonist both leaving on good terms with one another. The protagonist and the antagonist were going against each other, one wanting independency, one wanting reconciliation with Great Britain. The protagonist won, as he should have, as the musical and history shows us. Independency won out. But the antagonist still, even though he was defeated, gets to leave on good terms. And it's an interesting way to end our musical with the protagonist and antagonist showing mutual respect towards one another.
So as Dickinson is walking out, Hancock is ready to sign this document and asks if anyone else has any changes or anything before they start the signing. And Adams finally has one.
Which is weird, because this is the moment in the wedding ceremony, so to speak, where they say, speak now or forever hold your peace if you have any objection to why this Declaration of Independence should not be passed. And John Adams, the guy who is fighting for it, says, well, yeah, I actually do have one thing I want to change about this. And they have a little bit of a grammatical definitions battle back and forth about the word unalienable.
Which is a historical argument that they had, where Adams says, the word's actually unalienable. And Jefferson's like, no, sir, it's inalienable. In our musical, John Adams concedes, but leaves this snide remark of, I'll talk to the printer later about that. Which he must have in history, because Adams did win out. Unalienable is what's in the Declaration.
That's right. I appreciate the nod that this musical gives to the fact that John Hancock has the largest signature on the document. Whenever you hear people say, hey, put your John Hancock on this document, they're talking about your signature. They're talking about the Declaration of Independence. When John Hancock, as the president of Congress here, says, I'm going to sign it first, someone else looks at him and says, that's a pretty large signature, Johnny. And John Hancock acknowledges, yeah, it had to be so fat that King George in London could read it without his glasses on. He wanted to make sure that he could just hold this document up on the shores of the United States and let King George, from his throne in London, look across the seas and see Johnny Hancock's name right there in bold letters. And everyone gets a chuckle in that scene.
My favorite line is right after that, when he's encouraging everyone else to come sign it. And he says, all right, gentlemen, step right up. Don't miss your chance to commit treason.
To that, Franklin does say, Hancock's right. This paper is our passport to the gallows, but there's no backing out now. If we don't hang together, we shall most assuredly hang separately. And they have a little bit of a discussion about that. There's laughter. There's joy in the chamber now because everyone there is in favor of signing this document. And after a while, Hancock gets a little nervous and he says, gentlemen, forgive me if I don't join in the merriment, but if we're arrested now, my name is still the only one on this dang thing. And it's just funny. It's like if the idea that if spies came in right in that moment, they'd see, oh, John Hancock's the only one that we need to hang for this. And so it's fun. They all go up eventually in their turns and they start signing the document. But before anyone does follow John Hancock's suggestion and start signing the document, we do receive one more letter from George Washington's courier. Remember, throughout this musical, we've seen random little moments when letters from George Washington updating us on the troops, the Continental Army who is in New York with George Washington, updating us on what's happening there. And so at the end of our musical, we get to hear one more dispatch from New York City, where George Washington tells us that some really devastating things are happening. This is the moment from Hamilton, an American musical, where you saw the first battle in New York, where George Washington was getting frustrated and he said, are these the men with which I am to defend America? We ride at midnight, Manhattan in the distance. And here, in the letter from George Washington in 1776, he says, I can now report with some certainty that the eve of battle in New York is near at hand. Toward this end, I have ordered the evacuation of Manhattan and directed our defenses to take up stronger positions on the Brooklyn Heights. And you see that this is the retreat of George Washington's men, trying to get them into a better strategic position because he's trying to keep from losing New York, and it seems like a losing battle. This here, in my mind, echoes back to the way we ended the first act, where you see the soldier singing Mama Looks Sharp. You see that the war has been discussed and debated back and forth in the clean room of Philadelphia's Congress. But here you see that it's being fought on the bloody battlefields in New York and in other colonies. You see that something very intense is happening. and that the Congress's job is not yet done. They have passed the Declaration of Independence, which is the primary conflict of our musical. They've passed that. But now they have to exercise all of the rights as the de facto governing force of the colonies now. Until we receive the Articles of Confederation, these are the men who will decide whether George Washington gets the supplies he needs, the troops he needs, the support he needs. So it's a reminder at the end of our musical that John Adams' job has been accomplished in certain ways, but there's a lot more in John Adams' life that he is yet to do. There's a million things he hasn't done, but just you wait. Just you wait.
And at that point in the letter, when Washington discusses abandoning Manhattan, he starts to mention how many troops he has. And he says a total of 5,000 troops to stand against. And at that point, the courier pauses in horror. And it gets really dramatic here. This part of the letter gets really emotional.
It's astonishment as he's just shocked when he realizes that these 5,000 troops are against how many?
25,000 of the enemy. And Washington says he notices that many of them are lads under 15 and old men, none that you could truly call soldiers. And he does put in a personal note to someone there in Congress, Mr. Lewis Morris of New York. He regrets to tell him that his estate's been destroyed, but 8 of the children were moved safely to Connecticut. But 4 of those boys, the older ones, are now enlisted in the Continental Army. And he says, as he writes these words, the enemy's in plain sight. How it will end, only Providence can direct. But dear God, what brave men I shall lose before this business ends. And he ends his letter in a very familiar way to us that know Hamilton the musical. Your obedient, G. Washington.
One of the differences we saw between the film version and the version on stage from YouTube with the Rochester Players in 1995 was that the representative from New York in the Rochester version on YouTube was Mr. Livingston, one of the many New York Livingstons. And in the film adaptation of the musical and the original script to the musical, the representative from New York was, instead of Livingston, was Morris. And so in that letter, George Washington has announced that Morris, or Livingston, depending on which version you're watching, the representative from New York, who has abstained courteously from every single vote in Congress so far, George Washington tells him, your estate and your family and your sons are being affected. And so the representative from New York, who has abstained from letting his own voice be heard in this Congress so far, steps forward and says, before anyone else is called to sign this document, I have something to say. And he says, to hell with New York. I will sign the document anyways. To me, that's such a chilling, beautiful moment where you see that the investment is real now. It's no longer an abstract concept that we're debating. It's no longer an idea, an abstract concept that we're just debating in a hot room. It's now something that affects me personally. The effects of war touch me in a way that is personal and intimate now. And so even those people who saw it as an abstract thing to debate are going to attach their names to it because it's their brothers, it's their sons, it's their fathers, it's their friends who are taking up arms now to fight. It's their families, their wives, their daughters, their children who are going to be hurting in the conflict that is to come and that is already on their doorstep. And so this is a reminder here at the end of our musical of the devastating cost of independence and the fact that people have laid down their lives for this American dream of liberty and freedom and justice for as long as we have had an America. So you end the musical with just the simple recitation of these representatives. New Hampshire, Dr. Josiah Bartlett. Massachusetts, Mr. John Adams. Rhode Island, Mr. Stephen Hopkins. And they go through and list each of the states and their delegate that represents them, all the way through Georgia and Dr. Lyman Hall. And as the last man signs, the sound of the tolling Liberty Bell in the belfry becomes almost deafening, because the sound of liberty is ringing out.
And the scene freezes there to be reminiscent of the Trumbull painting. even though it's usually not depicted exactly like in the painting. That's the idea that they want to give you. Now, mentioning the Liberty Bell ringing out, technically this is a historical inaccuracy because at the time, Independence Hall's wooden steeple was structurally unstable and the Liberty Bell was silent, having been lowered into the upper chamber of the brick tower. Now, there was a smaller bell used to toll the hours that may have been rung, but not the Liberty Bell in this situation. But I really like that they use it in the musical. Great narrative effect there.
So here we are wrapping up our musical, which it seems premature to be ending another musical. We just ended the songs in Hamilton, and here we are. We just ended 1776 going through this. We hope you've enjoyed this musical as much as we have. It was a blast watching this, learning about it, seeing more of the things that came before Hamilton, but influenced Hamilton, and things that are a part of the Broadway and American history traditions.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this depiction of the coming together of the Declaration of Independence and the decision to declare independence. It was a really fun musical with a lot of fun songs in it, and it's a really good addition to the John Adams miniseries that we already covered.
This musical has been about the drafting and passing of the Declaration of Independence. Next week, we're going to dive into the Declaration of Independence a little bit more deeply, just looking at the history of the Declaration of Independence. What's inside of it? What is it saying? What's the big idea that they're trying to get across in that document? That'll be the first of many recurring 10-minute history segments that we plan to do on Hamilton the Podcast.
This episode of Hamilton the Podcast, along with every other episode on the Graphomania Podcast Network, is brought to you ad-free by our wonderful Patreon supporters. If you would like to give to the Graphomania Podcast Network and get a few exclusives for doing so, check out patreon.com/Graphocast. And remember, you can always contact us through email, contact@graphocast.com, on Twitter @Graphocast, or you can leave comments on the website, graphocast.com, graphocast.com. And I'm @FleshEater on Twitter.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
Until next week, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel.
Well, you can't meet Thomas Jefferson. He's dead.
Aw, but all the other cool podcasts get to do fun interviews.
Sorry. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter @Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.